Mark is a man on a mission. Let's like to start this morning's reflection by just restating the context out of which one should understand the story and others like it in the successive chapters. He is writing primarily to Jewish Christians who are frightened for their lives. He's also writing in a period of great political turmoil and transition. Many of his fellow Christians in Jerusalem have been kicked out of the synagogues for believing in Jesus. They are lost, displaced, and frightened. And secondly, there's this massive political and religious transition happening. The Romans have destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And with it comes the emerging of what we know today as Rabbinic Judaism, with its emphasis on teaching, observing the law, and simultaneously it ends the period of the Levitical priesthood from which Jewish religion had been known up to this particular point. And the Levitical priesthood was the main organizational feature of Jewish access to the divine. So with all of this stuff happening simultaneously, people are anxious, scared, wondering where they can find a place for themselves, much like the period we're in now, where so much of what we have known and believed and thought would always be is no longer the case. Where do we go from here? So what Mark does in the midst of all of this turmoil and with his intention for this gospel is to proclaim and to teach that Jesus the Christ is the promised Messiah. And he does it with an urgency that spares no room for doubt. With that in mind, we look at this morning's gospel story. It is probably one of the best known birthday party stories ever created. Now, since the word gospel means good news, I'm sad to report to you that today's gospel on the surface is not good news in the usual sense that we use that word. And so together we will have to look deeper into the foundations of the story, what it's showing us, what it's presenting to us, what it's pushing us to in the midst of our own world's transitions. So let us look at this story at one level with all of its intrigue and try to figure out why Mark has sandwiched this story between his sending of the disciples out in twos to preach and gave them authority to heal on the one hand, and the feeding of the 5,000 which follows this on the other hand. What is Mark trying to say to us, and what is the point of all of this? The story begins with Herod's hearing of Jesus and his miracles, and he speculates that this Jesus is the re-emerged or the re-resurrected John the Baptist who he had previously beheaded. Can you imagine how pale Herod became when he heard of this new prophet named Jesus, who was stirring up trouble, and as he would say, and it sounds like John the Baptist to him, he was sure it must be John coming back from the grave to get even. First introduction to intrigue. And he decided, in response, to have him taken care of a second time. In the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, we see how they struggle with telling this story and even trying to comment on its implications. Matthew shortens the story, and Luke decides to omit it altogether. And if you will remember why that is significant, is that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke rely heavily on Mark's Gospels for their own narrative. In fact, 3/4 of both Gospels are exact copies of Mark. So in fact, this unseemly narrative is actually, as we can tell, a story about political intrigue and manipulation. It's remarkable that Paul chose this opportunity after Jesus sent out his disciples on their first formal mission to report the death of John the Baptist. Mark hinted at this political death earlier in the story when John was arrested in chapter 1, verse 14, one sentence, and which said John the Baptist was arrested. Boom, drop, and he moved on. But he saves the full narrative until chapter 6, which we're reading this morning. Mark seems to have placed this account between the commission and the return of the disciples to intimate its significance for the expansion of Jesus' mission. This scene, in my opinion and the opinion of other scholars, is not simply an interlude or a space filler. The manner of John's death was intimately related to the mission of Jesus itself. Not only did John's mission meet with political obstacles, so would Jesus, as we've noticed in the last 2 Sundays, when the scribes thought his stuff was the result of demons, and his family thought he was out of his mind. And so it was also true for John and Jesus. It is true for Jesus' followers even to this day. In verses 14 to 16, which is transitional verses in this story, Mark expresses Herod's views of this Jesus movement. Now notice I said earlier, he's heard all the miracles and things that Jesus has done, was interested in meeting him, and at the same time he thought him a resurrected John the Baptist. Unlike other people who thought he was a prophet, again, Herod's assessment makes a close link between the missions of Jesus and John. Not only was Jesus' mission initiated after John's arrest, according to Mark in chapter 1, but Jesus' continual activity was viewed by the powers that be as intimately associated with John's. Notice, as you flow through this strange story of just intrigue, that this political intrigue and all the manipulation involved, and all the readings we've been reading in Mark so far about Jesus up to this particular point, being a prophet, not welcome in his own town, being rejected here and there, that this type of intrigue and manipulation isn't much different from today. Herod was like, and this is where my Americanism will come out, was like a first-century Richard Nixon, so blinded by ambition that he's willing to sacrifice his principles for political gains. Or maybe he seemed to you more like a Don Draper of Mad Men, so mired in a life of deception that he could hardly see the difference between a pitch and a profession with faith. Or he could be everyone's favorite, Donald Trump, so manipulative, makes this truth and outright lies into reality for people to believe. The fake news phenomenon created reality from fears and anxiety. Certainly, the moment in America represents the Jerusalem of Mark's gospel, particularly around the areas of the vaccine and the politicalization of the vaccines, the anxieties, the fears, all the stories around why one shouldn't do this. So could John the Baptist then, let me suggest, could he possibly be a Martin Luther King Jr. or an Archbishop Romero? Spiritual leaders willing to tell the truth to power at whatever the cost. Perhaps Herodias reminds you of Game of Thunder Cersei Lannister, who in a dramatic scene late in the first season justify a rather brutal course of action she would soon take on the basis of her love for her children. Might Herodias also want to protect herself and her children from John's claims, even if they are true? And have we considered the lengths to which we would go to protect our family from harm? You can see the story is much more an increasing web of intrigue, of manipulation. I believe Mark placed this story in this portion of the gospel for a reason. I have a hunch that Mark wants to impress deep in our imaginations two things. One, Jesus' ministry, like John's, has significant political implications. And I don't mean political in the sense of who to vote for. I mean that the kingdom Jesus preaches challenges our penchant for the status quo and are all too easy going along with the cultural presumptions that might, wealth, status, or fame makes right. Proclaim, then, Mark says, God's kingdom of mercy and grace, and as with Jesus and his forerunner John, there will be costs to pay. Secondly, I think Mark wants us to take seriously all that this story is representing, and that it is indeed the way of the world. Those who stand up often take a beating, and those who advocate an alternative to the status quo can usually expect those who benefit from the status quo to come down on them hard. We watch programs like, and I'm dating myself again, since I don't watch much TV these last couple of years, but I hope you get the point, like Newsroom, or the Old West Wing, and the like, because we see ourselves in them. We might not always like what we see, but at least it seems real. Mark is a realist. He is writing in the wake of widespread devastation caused by the Romans exercising their brutal power by destroying the Jerusalem temple. So part of why he tells this story is because this is the world as he knows it, the world he lives in, and by extension, as we look around us, the same world we live in now as well. So where is the gospel in all of this? It's the proverbial question that we always ask when we're in the middle of crisis. Where is God in all of this? Why is this happening? So we might have to look beyond this passage to find what the actual gospel intent is. Perhaps we can see and discover that this isn't the only story Mark is telling. It's not the whole story. What I've been describing is the way of the world, but it's not the whole story. Jesus comes precisely to show us that there is something more, something beyond the headache and intrigue and tragedies of the Herods, the Nixons, the Trumps, and even ourselves. This brings us to the heart of the gospel promise. We believe, we teach, and we confess that Jesus came to make possible for us more than mere survival, more than mere persistence, more than mere success. Jesus came to help us imagine that there is more to this life than we can perceive. Jesus came to offer us not just more life, but abundant life. Jesus came so that there could be a better ending to our stories and the stories of the world than we can imagine or construct on our own. And when the temple has just been destroyed, the temples of our society, the temples of our personal lives and circumstances, and I'll name a couple of them. Your marriage could be ending. You've just lost your job, or you fear that your child will never speak to you again, or you're pretty sure your friend has betrayed you, or you think you may have just messed up the one relationship that meant something to you, then the possibility of another ending, a good ending, is indeed not just good news, but the best news you can imagine. And it is in that we discover the good news of today's story. Amen.